An investigation into the agonizing dilemma of keeping nursing home patients alive for years with ventilators and feeding tubes. Environmentalists applaud Republican Mayor Kevin Faulconer's plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the city. And how hot is it? UC climate researchers argue that air temperature is a lousy gauge of the damage humans are causing the environment. I'm Mark Sauer, and the KPBS Roundtable starts now. It's Friday, October 3rd. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are reporter Brad Racino of iNewsSource, Andrew Keats, reporter with Voice of San Diego, and KPBS science and technology reporter David Wagner. Well, every story is heartrending. Victims of accidents or disease in unresponsive vegetative states kept on life support with ventilators and feeding tubes for years in some cases. The impossible choice of continuing on or pulling the plug falls on their families, but the cost for their care falls on all of us. iNewsSource spent 8 months exploring this choice facing San Diego families. And Brad, start by telling us what drew you and Joanne Farian and iNewsSource to this story in the first place.
Sure, and let me just start off by giving her all the credit in the world. This is really Joanne's story. I mean, I was an observer along with this and a videographer and photographer. But we had worked together on the hospice series last year when we were looking into San Diego hospice. And during that time, Joanne had talked to a few doctors who had mentioned the word vent farms. It was this kind of dark term that really meant subacute units. And the more she learned about them, the stranger they kind of became. And she asked a lot of professionals in her network that she knew what they knew about this. And a lot of doctors never even heard of this. So the more she learned, she found that there's this population, not just in California, but across the country, who are kept alive artificially through ventilators and feeding tubes. And it's not just the few people that you hear about in the news, like Terry Schiavo or Jahi McMath, that these are real people who this happens to, quite frequently. A lot of families are affected by this, and in California alone, there are about 4,700 people that are kept alive this way right now. And
we're going to get into those numbers and details in a moment. I should note Joanne is out of town today and couldn't join us on the roundtable. Give us a little bit of background, how difficult it was to really do this story and the access it took, and these folks really opened up.
Yeah.
To let you in their lives.
This was the hardest story I think either of us have ever worked on in terms of getting access. I mean, you're talking about serious privacy issues here when it comes to filming in a hospital or a nursing home or anything like that. And the only reason that Sharp told us that we were given access was because of Joanne's work on hospice, that they trusted us enough to tell the story right. They didn't know what we were going to tell. They just kind of opened the doors. But it took several months of meetings between Joanne and executives, as well as meetings with me and them as well about videotaping, to kind of get us to this point where we could go in and show people what this looks like.
How you're going to handle it tastefully and sensitively and yet get the full story out as you did. All right, start with that facility in Coronado. Describe what that's like.
Sure, it's called the Villa Coronado Subacute Unit, or Subacute Care Unit, and it houses right now about 62 people that are kept alive, mainly artificially through feeding tubes and tracheostomies. There are only about 15 or 16, I believe, who have some kind of illness. The rest have suffered some kind of brain injury, traumatic event that it just happened suddenly. Something happened, like the one person that we profile in the story, Steve Simmons. He and his wife were in a motorcycle accident. She had severe brain damage and has been living there for 4 years. The other family that we profile, Curcios, their daughter has, Nancy Curcio's daughter, Maria, has ALS, and she's been living there for more than a decade. So these are people that something happened to along the way.
And describe specifically now. We say they're unresponsive, they're vegetative. You mentioned Terry Schiavo, of course, a national case, which everyone can understand the situation there. These folks really don't have much hope at all over time.
No, according to the doctors and according to what we've seen, no, most of them do not get out of there alive. Most of them will be there until something overtakes them, whether it's an infection in that state, and they are hooked up. And Joanne points this out in one of our behind the story sequences about what you think life support looks like in your head and then what it actually looks like. And it's not, as she said, a person lying there peacefully in a bed. It's people who are hooked up to all these different apparatuses, and things are being done to them constantly. If they're having a tube put down their throat 5 times a day to suction mucus, if they're being turned, if anything, there's just stuff happening all the time.
Hygiene, waste, all of these things have to deal with. Let's drill into those numbers a little bit specifically. How many folks in California, how many here locally are in this situation?
Well, the number's been skyrocketing. Over the last 10 years, Joanne went back and got some data and showed that there were I believe in 2004, there were about 2,500 people living like this in California. Today, there are more than 4,700 living like this. So it's ballooned, and then the cost as well has more than doubled in those 10 years. We used to, in 2004, it was $328 million that the state paid for this coverage, and in 2014, it's $636 million.
And the state is picking up more than lion's share on the entire bill.
Yeah, because no one can afford to pay for this coverage. What happens is they go in and they deplete their savings, and then Medi-Cal kicks in. Medi-Cal is for the poor and disabled. Well, obviously they're disabled, but then they become poor because this costs up to $1,000 a day for a person to be taken care of.
Now, briefly, how does this compare, the numbers here, to other states in this southwest region?
California has by far the largest population. I mean, obviously there's a lot more people here, but in terms of percentages, California has around 4% of their nursing home residents are kept alive on life support. When you look at other states, you have New Mexico, there's about 0.3% of their population, Nevada, 2.5%, Arizona has about 1.8% of their population. But the numbers, I mean, you're talking about like dozens of people in these other states, are upwards of maybe 200. Here, we're thousands and thousands of people that are kept alive this way.
All right.
And maybe this is explained by one of the policy mechanisms that you mentioned in the story is that Medi-Cal has no cap on this, right? So unlike private care, which eventually you reach a point where it doesn't cover it anymore, Medi-Cal, you never reach that point. So is it the case that in other states there is a cap, or is there some other reason that might explain why California is so much higher?
Well, there's a couple reasons I think that Joanne went into, which is one, California kind of invented these units. So these were made to kind of have a place for people to go after the ICU. So that's one factor. The other, we don't know too much about the policies in different states. She tried to look into that, but I think it was nearly impossible to get the data and the policies for every single state about how they handle this coverage. We just know that California is definitely an outlier when it comes to this.
Well, one other point I wanted to make here before we get too more deeply into this is, how did we come to this? We want to look at a place where the families don't know what to do. They're not experts. Obviously, you said this happens suddenly in their life, and we've got a bite here from one of your experts, Dr. Joan Tenno, and what she had to say about her discoveries on this. Let's hear that.
Shocked. I started looking at it, and I thought, this is like a Robin Cook book. You know, it's like a vent farm.
Robin Cook wrote Coma, a medical thriller about brain-dead patients being kept alive. Tino says the financial incentives in the medical system are aligned with doing more at the end of life, procedures and hospitalizations, rather than letting go.
We pay for another day in the ICU. We don't pay for a physician to sit down and have that really difficult conversation with that family about what would your mother want under these circumstances.
All right, so that kind of gets to the whole crux of the impossible choice, and it gets to that whole debate we did have on this regarding death panels when Obamacare was being debated and voted on. What did you learn as you go forward, especially with an expert like this and the point she's making?
Well, yeah, this was under the original Affordable Care Act. There was this section that said that doctors will be reimbursed by the state for having these conversations. That was struck down, so they no longer do. It's easier for doctors and simpler for them to just perform a procedure rather than taking an hour out of their day to talk to family members and not get reimbursed. And also, doctors are a little hesitant about having that conversation when you look at kind of the medical malpractice suits in this country and how easy it is for people to bring that kind of lawsuit. They're much more comfortable with just doing what they do best, which is being a doctor.
Keep it going, keep the patient alive,
right.
And what about the American public? What have opinion polls said about this?
Opinion polls have, one came out relatively recently. It said most people, I think it was 66%,
yeah, that's the figure I have here,
say that patients should be allowed to die under some circumstances. 31% say that doctors should do everything medically possible to save a family member or someone they love.
And you mentioned earlier $700 to $1,000 a day, the millions, the hundreds of millions we talked about in California being picked up by the taxpayers. Are families really in a position to make this? They're obviously conflicted. They don't want to lose their loved one, and ultimately they're not medical experts. They're so close and involved in the situation. It seems like they'd be the last folks to really have the burden of this decision.
Right. They're not thinking that way when this happens. I mean, if there's a traumatic event to someone you love, you're not thinking about money right off the bat. You just want to keep them alive and keep them better. But what we saw is that a lot of families go through what's called this Medi-Cal spend down, where they have to deplete their assets to be covered under Medi-Cal. And most people don't think about that in the beginning, and then as Joe and Tino says in our story, it really affects them later on, and it's something that doctors, in her opinion, should relay to family members about what's going to happen to you and your money and everything like that.
Well, I congratulate iNewsSource on this. This is a tremendous story and very well done. And a note, if you missed iNewsSource's An Impossible Choice on KPBS or on the NewsHour, the PBS NewsHour, you can go to animpossiblechoice.org and see it there. And I'd encourage everybody to go ahead and do that. We're going to shift gears to an entirely different topic now. Though Congress won't even have a national debate on this critical issue, a climate action plan for San Diego was rolled out by Mayor Kevin Faulconer this week. Environmentalists applauded. The mayor, a moderate Republican, filled nearly the entire wish list put forth initially by Council President Todd Gloria, who's a liberal Democrat. And so, Andy, we're going to start this by hearing what the mayor said about his plan on KPBS just before he released it.
Working closely with my colleagues on the council, particularly Council President Gloria, who started this process when he was interim mayor, working with all stakeholders, environmental side, small businesses. I want to make sure and will insist that San Diego maintains our leadership role when it comes to the environment, sustainability, particularly solar, water recycling. We have the opportunity really to enhance our leadership in these good green economy jobs, and that we're doing the right thing.
All right, so did he please everybody in this one?
Yeah, I mean, you know, he tinkered with some things, but really it came down to one decision. And rolling this out in the last couple months, waiting for it to get to this point, was really all about one decision and one decision only in the plan, which was, you're going to have these benchmarks, but are they going to be lofty goals that it would be nice if we got to, if we, you know, we put it on a plan and you know, hey, you know, when we're thinking about these things, you know, remember, we're kind of trying to cut our greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2035, or would it be a document that says the city of San Diego is now legally obligated to reach these standards, and as such opens itself to potential lawsuits if they don't take certain steps to get there? And so that was really the decision. Will this be a lofty goal, or will this be an enforceable mandate? And so when he decided to make it an enforceable mandate, basically all the other details were things that I think the majority of the environmental community was going to be able to say, that's fine, but you know, we'll live with not getting everything we wanted there. We got the big thing.
All right, let's go into those details. Give us the high points and what the major, I think about 3 major changes are in this.
Sure. So he did. There was one thing that early on when Council President Gloria was interim mayor, he rolled this plan out, and one of the things that generated a lot of attention was the idea of putting in a mandate that when you came time to sell your house, you were going to have to retrofit it to make it more energy efficient. And this generated a lot of opposition from Realtors Association and all kinds of other groups like that, the Chamber of Commerce, but also just residents who saw this as something that was going to cost them money. That's been replaced with basically something that says, at the time you sell your home, you have to disclose how much energy your home uses.
So give the specifics, but don't change the windows out, don't do the insulation, don't do all these upgrades.
Yeah, and so they, you know, the other side of the mandate was going to be that they would have all these sweeteners, things that would help you finance improvements and help you do all this stuff, and that stuff's still in there. Mm-hmm. So environmentalists, you know, I think the majority I've talked to, they liked the idea of a mandate, but they were very willing to accept it as a compromise that was pulled off the table.
So David, we're going to talk, of course, in a moment about a broader aspect of climate change, but this is one city, one big American city. We're not having, as I said at the outset, the national debate. Does it make a lot of difference what San Diego does or San Francisco does or Denver does in the big picture?
Well, I mean, when you're looking at something like global temperatures, no. I mean, even as a big American city, we're a blip on that. But if you look at something specific like carbon emissions, I mean, we can take stock of what we're emitting and try to cut it. And you know, some of the goals in this plan were really jumped out at me. I think the transit ones specifically, because that's something that's actually going to change the way the city looks. And I think they're shooting for, in 20 years, having 25% of people take public transportation. Mm-hmm. Is that achievable?
Well, so you know, so keeping in mind there is some narrowing in that number. So it's not 20% of or 25% of everyone in San Diego. It's 25% of people who live within a half mile of a transit station.
So they've identified specific neighborhoods, specific communities.
Specific areas that are around either a trolley station or the new high-frequency bus stations or some other intersection that has a lot of bus service. So if you live there, then you'll be counted in that number.
Okay, now another part of that, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is those particular areas would then lend themselves to further development of higher density housing because they do have the access to the public transit, and some of the folks who live there are not happy about that and have not been happy about that at all.
Right, and I got to say, I think that's really the biggest change that having legally enforceable mandates makes is when the city's having these conversations that it's already been having, and that if anyone's been paying attention, haven't been going very well. Now they've got a completely different set of cards in their hands when they go to these neighborhoods, and they don't now say, listen, we adopted a general plan in 2008, and it says we really should grow in denser ways and not sprawl, and I know you guys don't like it, but really that's kind of what we said we were going to do. Now they can say, we have a legal obligation to the city to grow in this way. There's really nothing we can do about it, and it's just a completely different conversation from a leverage perspective once you open yourself up to lawsuits simply by not doing enough.
I think there'll be lawsuits on the other way saying we're sacrificing too much in Linda Vista or whichever community you're
Maybe,
talking
but that was probably going to happen anyway, right? That's when you lose out on a development decision, that's usually your last resort.
Right. Brad?
How open is this plan to change? Are they going to revisit every 5 years, look at benchmarks, look at numbers, and say, okay, we're on the way, or we need to slightly change things? Or is this set in stone that this will never change?
Yeah, so the way to think about it is this is a high-level policy document that sets these big standards. And then every little thing in between that gets the city there will have to be a completely separate action. So now you'll have city staff now with a bit of a fire lit underneath them, where they'll be motivated to bring all these little things like the disclosure ordinance before you sell a home. That'll have to be its own policy that comes through and goes to City Council for a vote. Any sort of development proposal will still have to go through policy for a vote. So I think the updates, insofar as you want to call them that, will basically be the implementation of all the little pieces that go into the plan. The big plan itself, though, is staying. That's not going to be changed anytime soon.
And what about the renewable energy goal? You're looking at 100% power from renewable energy sources by 2035. What's that, a little over 20 years from now? Is that really possible? And what happens to SDG&E if it is possible?
Right. So that was one of the big sources of contention over the last few months, which is there's this wonky term that it's a program called community choice aggregation, which is in the state of California, cities are allowed to declare themselves a community choice aggregator, which is a separate entity that will go out and purchase energy on the retail market, basically. So it'll pick out its own sources instead of all coal or natural gas. They'll be able to pick and choose and say we want to buy some solar power here and some wind power here, and we'll be able to maybe some biofuels and things like that, and they'll be able to cobble it together in whatever way they want. And then San Diego Gas and Electric, instead of being the person that's making those purchases, would be the entity that's just delivering them. So now there is one little change in this plan, which before it said we will implement a community choice aggregator by 2020. What the plan now says is we will explore a community choice aggregator in the next few years or some other situation that would allow us to get to 100% renewable energy. So it kind of opens the door for if San Diego Gas and Electric can figure out a way to do that within the next 20 years, then there's an option outside of just community choice aggregation.
All right, we're going to stay with this overall theme, but shift topics a little bit here. A pair of UC San Diego scientists are boldly challenging some conventions in the climate change discussion. They want to upend the fundamental metric used to measure our warming climate, and they made their argument in the influential journal Nature this week. So, David, tell us, who are these folks, who are these researchers, and what are they proposing?
Yeah, so it's two San Diego scientists. One of them is Charles Kennel. He used to be the director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, so he knows all the hard science behind climate models. He's got that background. And then there's David Victor, an international relations professor at UC San Diego. So he looks at what the global community is or is not doing on this issue. And yeah, the headline argument that they came out with this week was this 2-degree warming goal that we've kind of all agreed upon in the international...
2 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
It's about 3.5, 3.6 actually Fahrenheit, right?
Yeah, that we're going to try to not go above that.
Right.
It's not working politically. It's not even that scientifically useful. So they say we need new goals.
So all it does is measure air temperature 2 degrees, and I think since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're about at 0.8 degrees Fahrenheit so far in air temperature, but there's been a lag in recent years, as they noted in the commentary. Tell us about that in terms of the rise in air temperature.
Yeah, that's right. There's been a kind of global warming hiatus, you could call it, over the last 16 years.
This one metric.
Yeah, on surface air temperature. So if you limit your view to like 1998 to today, you could kind of fool yourself into thinking that there is no problem. You know, people are driving Priuses now using reusable grocery bags, so we've obviously solved the problem.
Right,
Temperatures are flat.
Insulated windows. And
Yeah, exactly. But, you know, look at the temperature. This metric goes up consistently, but maybe not steadily. It's more like a staircase. It kind of stays flat for a while, then spikes, then stays flat, then spikes.
So it goes in fits and starts.
Yeah, and we've seen a hiatus like this before. There was one from like the 40s through the 70s. But then it has to do with heat being trapped in the ocean, and then that heat being released through storm cycles that come around every few decades. So the world is heating up. It's just not heating up on this metric that we've all fixated on.
And the researchers make the point that the heat is going into the oceans, as you say, and if you start looking at melting ice in the polar regions and the Arctic, these are very alarming gauges of just how much heat is being put into the atmosphere.
Yeah, so average out all global temperatures, and we've stayed kind of flat over the last 16 years, but look at crucial regions like the Arctic, where polar ice caps are melting. Those have been heating up over this period.
And so this is what they're saying. We need to look at these other measures, these other gauges, to get a much clearer picture. A doctor wouldn't simply take your temperature. They note, they do blood pressure, they do blood testing, they urine tests, all sorts of other tests.
Yeah, a kind of array of vital signs for planetary health. Yeah.
I mean, well, it's an interesting thing. One of the points they made is that you know, by focusing on this one metric and the fact that it hasn't, that, you know, that we're in this kind of hiatus period, that it gives ammunition to the people who would like to motivate us to do nothing or to reject the idea that climate change is a real thing. And, you know, it's an interesting point, but I wonder, it's not as though those people are taking their time to assess all the facts and take a look at what is being published in Nature in the first place, right? These are people who don't want these policies to be enacted, and then are working backwards from there to find reasons to do it. So we could change whatever we want. It's just going to change the nature of, or the details of the opposition, not the nature of it, right?
So you're saying the climate change deniers will always be climate change deniers?
Right, yeah.
There's no amount of evidence.
But they can say, and even the researchers noted in their article, that, oh, you're moving the goalpost. Aha, it hasn't gone up, and now you've got to come up with some other reason, and you're losing the argument.
Yeah, the messaging on this is really tricky, and I did kind of wade into the climate change denial blogosphere to see how this was being received, and it's a lot of like, we told you so, you know, finally they admit global warming hasn't, you know, come to pass. You know, you can't really draw that conclusion if you actually read what they wrote, but yeah, I mean,
what I don't understand is this, quite simply. Homeowners buy fire insurance under the much smaller than 1% chance your house is going to burn down. But you're going to get a mortgage, you're going to buy fire insurance. If this is even a 5% chance, the consequences are so dire for every living thing on Earth.
It's existential.
Exactly.
Yeah. The thing that cracks me up is that the folks who try to split the baby, who say, you know, one of two things, which is either, yeah, this is happening, but it's not our fault, or this is happening.
Nothing we can do about it.
And it's like, well, if it's not our fault, but the end result is that, you know, downtown San Diego ends up underwater, how much solace is it going to be for you that in fact it wasn't our fault? So it's a good thing we didn't prepare for this. Right. I genuinely don't understand that.
Right, but the arguments of 97% of climate scientists around the world are that it's, one, happening, and two, humans are causing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, you know, going back to how we ended up with this 2-degree goal in the first place is kind of an interesting story. I mean, it kind of comes out of like UN meetings and other, you know, meetings that were happening in the 90s when countries were coming together and saying, like, we have to agree what we're shooting for here. Like, we have to, you know, come up with some sort of goal. And, you know, they didn't come up with the 1-degree goal because, like you said, we've almost already gotten there. So that's off the table. And they didn't go with 3 degrees or 4 degrees because climate scientists were telling them, like, that's a world we can't even
That's another
predict.
planet that we're not familiar with.
We don't know what would happen in that kind of scenario. So they just, you know, split the baby and went with 2 degrees. It's not even really specifically tied to any sort of specific model.
All right, a few seconds left here. Throw this out to everybody. Are we going to hear this in the national debate? 2 years we've got a presidential election, heard almost nothing. Climate change is reaching a tipping point real quickly.
I don't necessarily think so, although I do think it's interesting from a national political perspective that you have the only big city mayor who is a Republican, who just released a very progressive policy towards climate change.
All right, and we're going to have to leave it there. We are out of time. That does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Brad Racino of iNewsSource, Andrew Keats of Voice of San Diego, and David Wagner of KPBS News. A reminder, all of the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.